Under the searing Philippine sun, July 1945, a convoy of exhausted prisoners trudged down a dirt road toward an American field camp near Santo Tomas. Among them were women who had once lived in Tokyo's comfort. Nurses, clerks, wives of officers, now emaciated shadows draped in rags. Their backs were straight, but their legs trembled with each step. When the gates opened, they didn't know whether they were walking into salvation or another cage. The air smelled of smoke, sweat, and disinfectant, the sound of diesel trucks and foreign voices filling the humid air. A Marine corporal shouted an order, but the interpreter's words stopped them cold. The Japanese women were told to undress and bend down. The soldiers standing nearby stared in silence. Shame surged through the captives. They had been humiliated by their own army before surrender, but this command, coming from the victors, cut deeper than anything yet endured. They hesitated. The women exchanged glances of fear, disbelief, and pride. In their minds flickered images of Tokyo, of cherry blossoms and laughter before the war turned their world into ash. A young nurse named Aiko clutched her torn sleeve, whispering a prayer. The interpreter repeated the order more gently, explaining in broken Japanese that the Americans weren't punishing them. They were checking for lice and infection. But how could they trust that? The memory of bayonets and starvation was still too fresh. Some began to cry, others froze. The Marines looked away awkwardly, realizing the shame their words had caused. Then one soldier, an older medic with sunburned arms, stepped forward. Without raising his voice, he took off his helmet, knelt, and dipped a cloth in a basin of disinfectant. "You've suffered enough," he said quietly to his fellow Americans. "Let's do this right." Instead of stripping them, the medics asked each woman to roll up her sleeves. They washed the captives' wounds with antiseptic, cut away lice-ridden hair, and offered thin blankets to cover their shoulders. The women flinched at first, expecting pain, but the touch was gentle, almost reverent. The realization crept in slowly. The Americans weren't mocking them. They were treating them like human beings. Tears fell silently. The phrase, "It hurts when I sit," whispered by one of the younger women as she winced under treatment, became the medic's haunting memory. It wasn't a complaint of cruelty. It was the sound of someone rediscovering what mercy felt like. Outside the tent, a truck rumbled by, its cargo bed stacked with tins of corned beef, powdered milk, and crates of medical supplies. The war in the Pacific was nearly over. Japan's empire was collapsing, and across captured territories, American forces were discovering the aftermath of brutal internment camps. Civilians, Filipino, British, Dutch, and Japanese, were all malnourished and disease-ridden. At Santo Tomas, more than 3,000 internees had been rescued earlier that year. Now, the focus shifted to Japanese prisoners, a group many soldiers had never imagined would surrender. The sudden reversal, from mortal enemies to helpless captives, tested every notion of vengeance and humanity the Americans held. The U.S. Army's official directives were clear: all prisoners, regardless of nationality, were to receive medical care and rations equal to those of Allied troops. But in the field, emotion clashed with regulation. Many GIs had lost friends at Bataan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They'd seen what Japanese forces had done to civilians. Yet here they were, forced to look their enemy in the eye and choose decency over revenge. At first, some refused to help. Others watched the medics' compassion and said nothing. But hunger and empathy have a way of eroding hate faster than propaganda. As one corporal later wrote in his journal, "When I saw her ribs, I stopped seeing a soldier's widow. I saw my own sister." Days turned to weeks, and the camp transformed. The Japanese women began assisting the nurses, folding bandages, organizing medicine, even teaching origami to children from nearby villages. They learned fragments of English: "thank you," "water," and "no pain." The soldiers, in turn, picked up phrases in Japanese. Barriers that once seemed carved in stone began to blur in the suffocating heat. The women's fears softened into cautious gratitude. They were still prisoners, but for the first time, they could sleep without terror. News of Japan's surrender in August spread like wildfire through the camp. Some prisoners fell to their knees. Others simply stared into the distance. The Americans did not celebrate loudly. They'd seen too much. The medics gathered the Japanese women in the yard and told them they would soon be repatriated. No cheers followed. Many of the women wept silently, thinking of the homes that no longer existed, the families lost beneath the rubble of Tokyo and Hiroshima. For them, victory and defeat were meaningless words. Survival was all that remained. In the final days before departure, a group of Marines organized a small farewell meal. They opened their ration tins, shared cigarettes, and offered coffee, hot, bitter, and foreign. The women accepted, bowing deeply, unsure how to express what they felt. The same corporal who had once shouted at them now helped a frail widow climb onto a transport truck. He didn't speak her language, but when their eyes met, she nodded faintly, as if forgiving the entire war in a single glance. Behind them, the camp's flag fluttered in the humid wind. The war had begun with hate so complete that even mercy seemed impossible. Yet here, on a dusty patch of earth far from the ruins of Tokyo, compassion had quietly reclaimed its place. In the long silence after the trucks departed, the medics stood watching the road disappear into the horizon. They had treated the enemy and, in doing so, healed something invisible within themselves, but not everyone understood. Reports from nearby units described American soldiers appalled that kindness had been shown to those they blamed for Pearl Harbor. Commanders defended the medics' actions, citing the Geneva Conventions and the need to set an example for how prisoners of any nation should be treated. Still, rumors spread, claims of favoritism, of softness, of betraying fallen comrades. For every man who offered a blanket, another clenched his fists in resentment. The contradictions of victory were now undeniable. Mercy, vengeance, justice. Each word carried a weight too heavy for soldiers barely out of their teens. The women, broken but alive, carried their own burden. The knowledge that their enemy had shown them a gentleness their own leaders had denied. In the coming months, they would be transported back to a shattered homeland, where the memory of that camp would live quietly beneath the rubble and shame. Yet for those who served at Santo Tomas, the memory lingered too. The sight of women who flinched at touch, then slowly learned to trust again. The war was ending, but its moral aftershocks were just beginning. What happened on that humid afternoon? The order to undress, the hesitation, the unexpected compassion would ripple through the decades. It was a moment when the victor's humanity was tested not by triumph, but by mercy. And though the women left scarred, some walking with difficulty, whispering, "It hurts when I sit," they carried within them proof that even in the ruins of war, decency could survive. The question that haunted every soldier who witnessed it was simple and terrifying in its depth. After everything they had seen, who were the real prisoners, the defeated women walking home, or the men still trapped by their own hatred? The answer would unfold in the months that followed, when compassion itself became a weapon far more powerful than any rifle. When the ships carrying the repatriated Japanese women docked at Yokohama in late September 1945, the harbor was an open wound of twisted steel and ash. The air still carried the bitter tang of burnt oil and salt. American nurses escorted the women down gangways under the gaze of both occupying soldiers and stunned civilians. Word spread quickly through the ruins. Japanese women had been rescued, treated, and fed by Americans. It sounded impossible, almost like propaganda in reverse. For months, Japan's war machine had warned that surrender meant dishonor and torture. Now, survivors stepped ashore wearing U.S. Army blankets. Their hollow faces told the truth better than any leaflet ever could. The story of their treatment at Santo Tomas did not remain isolated. Across the Pacific, from Guam to Saipan to the Philippines, American medical units were encountering Japanese civilians and POWs in desperate condition. The Army's medical corps, hardened by years of tropical disease and combat trauma, faced a new challenge: rebuilding human beings who had been starved, beaten, and broken by their own collapsing empire. Field hospitals, once dedicated to patching up soldiers for the front, became humanitarian centers. Doctors like Lieutenant Colonel Ralph L. Folsom, who had designed improvised sanitation systems for jungle warfare, now turned their expertise toward keeping former enemies alive. Engineers rigged water filtration from old tank fuel lines. Signalmen converted field radios into makeshift intercoms between wards. In war's final months, the instruments of destruction were retooled for mercy, the shock among. Japanese survivors deepened when they learned that the very rations sustaining them had come from the same supply lines that once fed their enemy. Each can of corned beef and each tablet of sulfa drugs carried markings, U.S. Army Medical Department, symbols of the industrial machine that had crushed their empire. Yet inside these tins was the one thing imperial propaganda had denied existed: compassion from the enemy. Reports from surviving nurses described the disbelief that followed every act of kindness. They cleaned our wounds as if we were their own, one woman recalled to an interpreter years later. For them, the enemy's mercy was not merely unexpected. It was destabilizing, even frightening. It contradicted everything they had been taught about honor and shame. Behind that compassion, however, lay meticulous planning and engineering. The American logistical network in the Pacific was a masterpiece of modern warfare, an empire of supply that could feed, fuel, and heal millions across thousands of miles. Its architects were not generals, but engineers and factory workers from places like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and San Francisco. Companies such as Johnson & Johnson, Parke-Davis, and General Electric had transformed assembly lines into lifelines. Every bandage, every ampoule of penicillin, was a product of coordinated industrial genius. Refrigerated ships known as reefer vessels carried medical cargo that remained sterile even in tropical heat, while portable field sterilizers ensured instruments stayed usable in remote outposts. Without these innovations, the rescue of POWs and civilians alike would have been impossible. Japanese survivors, once indoctrinated to see Americans as barbarians, now witnessed technology used not for annihilation, but for restoration. One group of women assigned to a Red Cross camp near Tokyo was astonished by the efficiency of American field kitchens. The use of aluminum trays, standardized ladles, and sterilized utensils represented a level of organization unseen in Japan's shattered cities. "They eat with order," one nurse observed quietly to another. "Even mercy is mechanical." That phrase captured the paradox of post-war relief, the industrial might that had delivered destruction was now being applied to healing. But not all encounters ended with understanding. Many Japanese officers, now POWs themselves, refused treatment or food from American medics, considering it dishonorable. Some female prisoners, overwhelmed by guilt for surviving when others had not, refused nourishment until nurses physically intervened. In one documented case at a camp near Manila, an American medic spent 3 hours persuading a Japanese midwife to drink water. "You are no longer an enemy," he told her softly. "You're someone I can help." She wept for an hour before obeying. These small, quiet acts of care carried more psychological weight than any political order. For the Americans, too, compassion came at a cost. Many soldiers struggled to reconcile their humanity with the fury still burning from years of brutal combat. Letters home reveal a pattern. Men who had witnessed atrocities now questioning what victory truly meant. "I can't hate them anymore," one Marine wrote. "They look just like the people we saved in France." This moral shift marked the beginning of a transformation in Allied conduct, a move toward what would later be called psychological warfare. Though at the time it was simple decency in action, the Japanese government, under U.S. occupation, began documenting testimonies from repatriated civilians. Among them were several of the women from Santo Tomas. Their stories spread through the ruins like whispers. The Americans had treated them with medicine and food, not whips or humiliation. For many, this became the first humanizing image of the occupiers. It laid the groundwork for Japan's post-war re-education campaign, showing that the victor's strength came not only from weapons, but also from restraint. Cultural anthropologists working with the occupation authorities later noted that such encounters did more to dismantle militarist ideology than any speech or trial. The power behind this mercy was technological as much as moral. Portable X-ray units powered by Jeep generators, sterilization drums fashioned from aircraft aluminum, and plasma transfusion kits developed by engineers at the Army Medical Research Laboratory turned frontline medics into mobile hospitals. Japanese nurses watched in fascination as American corpsmen operated hand-cranked centrifuges and field autoclaves, devices that seemed like magic compared to their pre-war equipment. The mechanical hum of these instruments symbolized something profound. The same science that had fueled destruction was now being repurposed for healing. In one notable episode at a relief camp near Nagasaki, American doctors treated burn victims from the atomic blast using techniques adapted from aircraft accident medicine. Saline drips replaced lost fluids, while sulfa dressings prevented infection. A Japanese woman survivor, barely conscious, whispered gratitude before dying. The attending surgeon, hardened by years of combat, removed his gloves and stood silently beside her stretcher. In that moment, technology, duty, and humanity merged into one unbearable truth. The tools that saved lives were born from the same knowledge that had ended so many. As these operations expanded, the United States military began recording data for future humanitarian missions. Engineers from the Corps of Engineers collaborated with medical officers to design modular hospital units that could be airlifted anywhere in the Pacific. These blueprints would later evolve into the foundation of modern disaster relief systems. The seed of post-war reconstruction, the idea that engineering and compassion could coexist, was sown in the ashes of defeated Japan. By the year's end, over 700,000 Japanese civilians and POWs had received medical attention or sustenance from Allied forces. The women of Santo Tomas were among the first. Their accounts would quietly influence American policy in occupied territories, guiding how mercy could rebuild a nation. For both sides, the war's end was no longer a clean victory or defeat. It was a reckoning with the meaning of civilization itself. And yet, beneath the growing machinery of relief, darker questions simmered. Could mercy be trusted after such devastation? Could enemies ever become equals? The sight of American soldiers feeding Japanese children by hand stirred admiration in some, disgust in others. Compassion, once considered weakness, had become the final battlefield. The women who had whispered, "It hurts when I sit," would soon learn that the pain of healing, the moral ache of survival, was far more complicated than the wounds left by war. By early 1946, Japan had become a nation of ghosts trying to remember how to live. The occupation was in full force, and the American flag hung over Tokyo's shattered ministries like a symbol of both dominance and deliverance. Yet behind the headlines of tribunals and reconstruction, quieter stories took root. Those of women who had once been prisoners and now found themselves working alongside their former captors in hospitals, relief centers, and schools. Among them were several of the Santo Tomas survivors, their bodies still marked by malnutrition, but their spirits determined to rebuild. Their experience had changed them. Mercy from the enemy had redefined what victory and defeat meant. And in the post-war silence, that mercy began to reshape Japan itself. The Americans running the occupation understood that stability would not come from force alone. General Douglas MacArthur's administration believed that compassion, structured, disciplined, and strategic, could pacify a broken society faster than punishment. Food programs were expanded, medical facilities rebuilt, and teachers retrained under Allied supervision. At the core of these reforms were women who had once been POWs. They became translators, aides, and instructors, teaching sanitation and nursing techniques learned from their American caretakers. What began as a humanitarian necessity evolved into a cultural exchange that softened centuries of enmity. When a U.S. medic taught a Japanese nurse to prepare plasma, both were participating in something larger than medicine, the redefinition of human dignity. Psychologists attached to the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey conducted interviews across Japan, recording how mercy from American troops affected morale. Their findings surprised even the most hardened officials. Many civilians, they discovered, associated kindness from occupiers with legitimacy, proof that the Americans were not conquerors, but caretakers. One report noted that benevolence in the face of total victory achieved more influence than any weapon. For women who had endured the shame of captivity, this realization carried deep emotional weight. Their treatment at Santo Tomas and other camps had stripped away propaganda and left behind a painful but liberating truth: humanity had survived the empire. Among American soldiers, the transformation was equally profound. Men who had once fought through jungles now found themselves serving in maternity wards and pediatric clinics, helping deliver babies to women whose husbands had died fighting against them. For many, it was the first time they felt they were building something rather than destroying it. The letters home from these medics spoke of humility and of bewilderment at finding compassion in the ruins. "We fought monsters," one sergeant wrote, "but in healing their people, I think we found what we were fighting for." The war had turned them into killers. The peace was teaching them how to be human again. Factories that once forged weapons were repurposed into manufacturers of hospital beds, syringes, and medical instruments. Engineers who had built bombers now refined designs for prosthetic limbs. American aid flowed in steel containers and humanitarian blueprints. Technical manuals turned into manuals for recovery. The logistical genius that once supplied the world's largest military campaign was now rebuilding an entire nation's health system. In that process, the Japanese women once humiliated by orders to undress found themselves teaching others to trust those same instruments, the same antiseptic smell that once symbolized shame now becoming the scent of renewal. For many survivors, the most difficult wounds were invisible. The trauma of captivity lingered long after the bruises healed. Psychiatrists attached to the occupation forces began documenting what they called survivor's restraint, the tendency of former prisoners, especially women, to suppress emotion in gratitude for survival. Their restraint was misread by Americans as politeness, but it masked deep confusion. How could kindness from the enemy coexist with memories of bombings and starvation? Yet those same women became advocates of reconciliation, writing essays and giving testimonies that urged their people to see the Americans not as conquerors, but as partners in rebuilding. Their words carried the quiet authority of experience that no official decree could match. The moral weight of their stories spread beyond Japan. In Europe, American policymakers studying the occupation drew direct parallels between mercy in the Pacific and rehabilitation in Germany. The idea that decency could neutralize extremism began to shape post-war strategy worldwide. From the Marshall Plan's humanitarian backbone to the Geneva Convention's renewed enforcement, the lessons learned from treating Japanese POWs influenced an entire generation of international policy. It was no longer enough to defeat an enemy. One had to rehabilitate them to prevent another war. In that sense, the compassion shown to a handful of starving women in a Philippine camp became a quiet prototype for modern peacekeeping. Yet, not all lessons were comfortable. For every act of mercy remembered, there were voices that accused America of hypocrisy, of bombing cities only to hand out medicine later. Critics within the occupation noted that kindness was also a form of control, a soft weapon ensuring compliance through gratitude. The line between compassion and domination blurred easily when power was absolute. But to the women who had felt the trembling hands of an American medic cleaning their wounds, motives mattered less than moments. For them, mercy had not been political. It had been human, and in their frail voices, that human truth carried further than any ideology. As the 1950s dawned, Japan was reborn, not as an empire, but as a nation built upon the paradox of defeat and renewal. The children of those POWs grew up hearing stories of how their mothers had been shown kindness by the very soldiers who had destroyed their homeland. These memories seeded a generation that valued peace over pride and cooperation over conquest. When Japan emerged as a technological power decades later, many of its engineers and doctors traced their inspiration back to the American hospitals and relief centers that had once healed their parents. Mercy had become an inheritance. In the United States, veterans who had served in post-war Japan carried their memories home quietly. Some became doctors, some teachers, and others simply fathers who raised their children to believe that decency was not weakness. The phrase that had haunted the medics of Santo Tomas, "It hurts when I sit," became, for one surgeon, the title of a memoir that explored the moral ache of compassion in wartime. He wrote of how he learned that pain and healing were inseparable, that both demanded humility. "We thought we were fixing their bodies," he confessed, "but they were repairing our souls." The final years of occupation closed with a symbolic gesture. At a ceremony in Tokyo, American and Japanese nurses stood side by side as a hospital reopened under joint administration. Among the attendants was Aiko, the young woman once told to undress at gunpoint. She walked with a slight limp, but carried herself with quiet dignity. When an American colonel approached to thank her for her service, she bowed deeply and said in halting English, "You taught us to be gentle again." The colonel, who had fought on Saipan, removed his cap and returned the bow. In that brief exchange lay the entire transformation of a war that had begun in fire and ended in empathy. The legacy of that moment endures in the DNA of modern humanitarian warfare, the belief that victory is measured not in enemy deaths, but in lives restored. From Korea to Iraq, from tsunami relief to refugee aid, The lessons first written in blood and mercy at Santo Tomas echo quietly through military hospitals and relief tents around the world. For those who study that era, the story of the Japanese women POWs remains one of history's rare miracles, a moment when compassion proved stronger than vengeance. War ends in silence, but its echoes define what follows. In that silence, the whisper of a wounded woman, "It hurts when I sit," still carries. It speaks not of suffering alone, but of endurance, of pain accepted as proof that life has returned. The greatest victory of all was not the surrender signed aboard a battleship, but the rediscovery of humanity between enemies who had every reason to hate. And in the end, that mercy became the truest monument of the Pacific War, one carved not in stone, but in the fragile, forgiving hearts of those who survived it.